to Thriving Together, Stories from CCEJ, a podcast from the California Conference for Equality and Justice. Our mission is to educate and empower youth and adults to lead change for equity and justice in our communities. I'm Daniel Solis, your host. Today, we're excited to share a behind-the-scenes look at how we're growing and evolving as an organization through something called organizational learning. You'll hear directly from CCEJ's Director of Leadership and Learning, Kathleah Pagdilao, about what this work looks like, why it matters, and how it connects to our mission of advancing equity and justice. So welcome. We're excited to have this conversation with you today. And so to get us started, could you share your name, your role, pronouns, and maybe something fun about yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Kathleah Pagdilao. My pronouns are she, her, and Shaw. And my role is Director of Learning and Leadership, which means I get to do training work with folks, but also lead our internal work, which we'll talk more about. And something fun about myself is I actually really love line dancing.
Okay.
The reason it's coming up is because it happened this weekend. I was at an event and it was something that helped me be present and in my body. And actually we were at a retreat. We were at our restorative justice retreat that we ran this month, whenever that was. And we actually did some line dancing there and actually realized part of the reason I like it is because it actually has structure, and I love structure, and it allows expression, but through a very clear way of engaging with music. So
very cool. And I feel like there was an embedded learning moment in this little anecdote.
Correct. Yes. Everything can connect to learning. Absolutely.
Well, that actually is a good place to maybe get started, right? What do you define organizational learning as?
Yeah. So organizational learning is really about the processes and practices for us to, within organizations to experience learning together in hopes of having deep reflection, having information sharing be in flow, right? And all in service of improving our work, right? Improving the ways that we move together, right? The content, the skills that we have as individuals, as a team, in order to serve our mission, right? And so I think something that's important to think about when we're thinking about organizational learning is at the different levels, how are we engaging, right? So we've got the individual really doing the intentional work to self-reflect, to think about what are the skills, what are the knowledge pieces that I need to work on? And then also as a group, how are we committed to making sure that learning is always a part of our process and that we never get stagnant in kind of the things that we know, the ways that we do things.
So that sounds a lot bigger than maybe I just go to a professional development training, maybe I read an article here or there. It sounds like it's a much more intentional thing, a much more planned thing, and something that permeates the whole organization. Would you say that that's right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're reminding me that CCEJ has always been committed to learning and growing and doing this work. And in recent years, right, we have created a deeper culture around learning because it can get away from us, sometimes. I think in our day-to-day, it can be really challenging to fit in, those article readings or the moments of conversations with our colleagues about, what worked, what didn't when we're thinking about our programming. And so we've created just more structures and more times, frankly, for us to engage in learning so that, again, we are having that be a part of our DNA rather than something that we, come to every now and again.
And so since, organizational learning is still, in its early phases here at CCJ, I imagine it might also be new for some of the folks listening. So I was wondering if maybe you can just give us a typical week of organizational learning looks like. What does that show up, right? How does that maybe happen in surprising ways? How maybe happens in big ways, little ways? Just kind of help us kind of ground us in that.
Yes, I love that. So I will first start by saying that no days ever look the same. I think that's true across all nonprofits, other organizations, and I think in a different way. Especially for me in my role, being the first Director of Learning and Leadership, I think there's been just a lot of tinkering and experimentation, and so each week looks different. So that could include, when it comes to my training side of the work, right, supporting my team to do trainings that's separate from org learning, but definitely, is infused and kind of crosses departments, if you will, or crosses between the work. And so I'll be doing, things that my teammates are doing in terms of trainings, coaching, But when it comes to our org learning work, I'm really doing research on like different things that perhaps we need to continue learning on, right? Looking up articles, videos for folks to access. I might be coaching individual staff, so really providing some tailored support on maybe some skills that they need to work on, perhaps like looking at professional development opportunities, right? We are so fortunate here at CCEJ to have funds to support our individual learning and growing in professional development, and sometimes we don't have the time perhaps to like look up opportunities, so I'm happy to do research and see like what's out there and what can we tap into. Also noticing gaps in things that are happening, right? So I'm constantly trying to assess like where things are at so that we can respond in real time to what staff's individual as well as our team needs are. I might be creating curriculum for an internal learning opportunity, so we have some dedicated times every month basically for our team to get together and do some learning around different topics, whether that's, challenging perfectionism or project management, all these different things that go into our work, really doing research to continue, developing our resource guide, for example.
Well, we had a recent field trip, right?
Yes.
So maybe you could talk about that process.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, so that's not every week, unfortunately. I would love if that was every week. Yeah. But we had our very first CCJ field trip where we got to go visit One Archives in LA, which is the largest LGBTQIA plus repository in the world. And so our team got to go into LA together and be in the space of all this queer and trans wisdom and resources and be in dialogue together. And so as you can imagine, that took some coordinating on my end. So really kind of digging into, first of all, like seeing like what's out there in terms of where we can take field trips and engage in, contacting, of course, the site, coordinating with them, making sure that our team is ready to go, right? So all the like event planning things were definitely part of that as well. And I think that that's part of a role such as mine in terms of learning and leadership, is being able to curate experiences that are meaningful and that are also centered on community building. Not to go on off a tangent, but I do think part of why we're able to do the work that we do is because we already have such a huge culture in community building. And I definitely see org learning as part of community building, right? We're building knowledge, we're building power in the way that we're learning together and working alongside each other.
Yeah, no. And as someone who was there, I can definitely attest that it was a fun, an interesting experience, just getting to hear stories from all sorts of places. So it was very fun. And then we got to eat some really good lunch afterwards. Yes. So that was fun. You kind of given us a little bit of like some examples, help us kind of think about what does it look like to do organizational learning on a day-to-day, weekly basis, and kind of some of these bigger projects. But I was wondering if maybe you can kind of zoom out a little bit, and if you could maybe help us think about and understand why has CCEJ invested time, staff, and funding into its internal organizational learning, right? Because you said you're the first director of learning and leadership, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a position we created. Yeah. So I was just curious if you could help us understand why so much all this work.
Yes. I mean, first and foremost, you shared our mission at the top of this podcast episode, and as an org that educates other organizations and workplaces and groups, right, it is important that we also educate ourselves, right? We do our own learning and growing. And again, just so that we don't remain stagnant, so we are dynamic and able to respond to things that are happening. I think too, the work of, educating other folks, right? We do bring in skills, we bring in content, right? That perhaps, are filling in some gaps and creating opportunities for folks to learn and grow. And so that's also allowed us to experiment with things. And so there are things that we've done internally that like work for us that we are able to also then bring into other spaces, whether that's a huge thing we've been working on, for example, our skills in direct communication, right? So I think that's something we see, not just internally, but also in other organizations, is the fact that we need better communication and we need to be more direct and we need to make sure that we are being authentic and real, right? And kind of the way that we're interacting with each other, and not just on, it can include a personal level, but also when we're thinking about the work that we do, right? Are we able to give each other feedback, right? Are we able to be honest, right, about impact perhaps that we have in our interpersonal working relationships as well as through programming? And so I think that's a huge part of why org learning is important to us, is to make sure that we are creating avenues for folks to both affirm one another and also to hold each other accountable, right? Because that's ultimately through the feedback of others, right, through self-reflection of ourselves, we can create change and we can create opportunities for us to transform in community and as individuals that wouldn't be possible, right, if we didn't have like that feedback culture. And so I think that's been a huge part of why, at least it's evolved into that kind of importance of why org learning.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's exciting to think about why this work's important to our mission and it really being clear that like the time, the staffing, the resources, right? Having everybody go on a field trip, right? Having people do coaching, mandatory, PD stuff, that it's all about alignment with our mission, right? And so I guess kind of thinking about the other side of that experience. So like, I was wondering if you could maybe talk about, now that we've been doing this organizational learning work for 3 years, 2.5 years, what do you think has been the impact on the people we serve, right? The communities that we're working with. So kind of taking it outside of our own benefit, what do you see has been the impact of all this work and investment and to our mission?
I think the first thing that comes up for me is thinking about our individual staff, right? And thinking about the work that we've been doing, whether through direct communication or like through our project management skills, right? All the things that we are doing to improve our work, of course, are directly and indirectly impacting the quality of our work. And I think so that's one way. I think too, the more we're able to embody perhaps some of the things that we are bringing to other folks, that becomes more real. I think it's beautiful when we're able to speak to our own experiences. I think being honest about, for example, going back to direct communication, right? The fact that as an org that is committed to justice work and committed to doing this work, right, it can still be hard to engage in maybe those tough conversations that kind of work requires of us. And so I think there's something beautiful about us being honest about, we also struggle with this, right? And to be able to speak to experiences that we have had, right, in kind of navigating different challenging conversations or, the struggles that we might have. I think that is great for folks to know, right? We're not perfect either. We're not, and that's not the goal, right? The goal is not to be perfect in this, but the goal is to try. And so I think when we're trying to improve and grow, that can be such a beautiful role modeling, I hope, for other folks to look at our work and see there's not an end point, right, to all of this, and we're really just kind of figuring it out as we go as well, and ultimately supporting each other. I think that's been a huge part of this work, is that we are able to see one another in our full humanity in this work and actually acknowledge, right, we're going to make mistakes and that's okay, and we're going to get feedback, and it's just about how do we then improve from that, right? And so I think that again, directly and indirectly kind of bleeds into our work with other folks. And then maybe the more nerdy things to say are around it helps us improve our curriculum, right? That ultimately reaches folks. It helps us improve activities. So as we are practicing internally, right, that allows us to, again, continue that cycle of change and improvement so that we can, just continue to create the best possible experiences for folks we're working with.
And I wonder, sometimes a story is maybe a helpful way to think about what does that actually look like? How does it feel? And we're an organization that loves telling stories. So I was wondering maybe if you could share, obviously anonymous, confidential story, but maybe share a story of a time when you saw the work of organizational learning benefit, help contribute to the folks that we serve, whether it's young folks, whether it's adults. Just curious, if there's a story that could help us kind of capture it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The thing coming up for me right now is with this culture of wanting direct feedback, wanting to improve our work. We did have a recent experience, right, where we had an event and there were some comments made that we were called in for, right, as being adultist, right? So for those that don't know, adultism, right, refers to the ways in which as adults, right, we are in a place of privilege and that we are seen and heard in a way that young people are not, right? And the fact that there are these narratives about young people are the future and their experiences maybe don't necessarily matter now, right, is some of those messages. And so we got called in on that, right? And I think in previous versions of, at least in my personal work, I think there might have been defensiveness. There might have been kind of a throwing one's arms up and kind of being oh no, we're not that way, right? And I think because we're focused on learning and growing, we were able to receive that feedback and to actually have a conversation with the folks that gave us that feedback. So we got to listen to the young folks kind of share what their concerns were. And that actually led to some also internal conversations. And now we're also thinking about how do we continue just growing in that topic, right? And so that, I think, speaks to the fact that we're willing to get that kind of feedback and like internalize it and do something with it, right? Like to create the change that needs to happen because we got this feedback that we were making some adultist comments. So I think that hopefully is a story that kind of demonstrates, right, the value of learning, because if we weren't in that space, if we weren't willing to listen and have those conversations, then the learning wouldn't be possible, right? And we couldn't then improve the work that we're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And, it might feel like airing a little bit of our dirty laundry, but I think that's also one of the things we've tried to build, right, through our organizational learning is that we have to kind of own when we make mistakes and learn from it, right?
Right.
So I just appreciate you kind of sharing that moment of like, where you can see that this work has shifted how maybe we would have responded, right? The work that we have to put in, kind of especially in those moments where maybe we're going to feel uncomfortable, maybe we're going to feel bad about an impact we had, and the learning kind of helps us kind of get through that, right? The intentional work of practicing that before, right? So I do definitely really appreciate that. But what does it take to actually build organizational learning within an organization?
Yes. Love this question. I could probably talk all day about it, but I think the things coming up are around, well, first of all, commitment, right? Any effort, project, initiative that an org commits to requires that we invest time, right, and resources into it. And so I think it's been a huge help that our leadership team, our executive director, right, like is committed to organizational learning. And so I think that's been a huge help for leadership to be on board and to message that across the team. And then also too, commitment from the individuals, right? Like it's great that I'm creating curriculum and it's great that I'm like creating learning opportunities, but that's meaningless without the people involved, right? And so I think it does take folks really just setting aside the time and the effort to prioritize learning. And we do that in lots of different ways here at CCEJ. We've learned that, we just need to carve out those times. So we actually have like those monthly learning sessions, right? We also have internal coaching. So I think there's also a need to build some infrastructure, whatever that looks like, tailored to the organization that kind of meets the needs of folks. And part of why we know our needs is that we actually do now a yearly organizational learning assessment. So I love data. So being able to know like what is important, right? Where are folks feeling supported already? And then also where are they feeling they need either more tools, more resources, more group learning opportunities, right, is huge. And so I think that allows us to, again, just meet the needs that are emerging. I don't like the word mandatory, but there are some things, right, that because of our commitment, we want to make required for folks. And so we do require folks to engage in a certain number of like experiences, right? And not that the number matters, but it's more about how are we all contributing to the culture of learning. And I have found that showing up is like a huge part of that. There's such value in even just as staff coming together to say like, here's what's challenging right now, right? What are some strategies folks use? And I've witnessed such power in folks, even just sharing their stories about their work and what's challenging and strategies folks are using. So I do think that dedicated time and space is huge. We already talked about it already, but I think developing a feedback culture, right, for folks to really engage in learning in a meaningful way has been really important so that we know like where things are at, again, what needs are emerging. And then again, I think just starting small, like org learning doesn't have to be a certain way, right? I think it, again, should be tailored to what the needs of the individuals and the org are. And there needs to be a willingness to try things on and make mistakes and try again. And so it's just how do we create a cycle where we're able to tinker and experiment and play and like be in community with each other and then take that, of course, into the way that we're continuing to move and do our programming.
I think sometimes, you hear something like organizational learning or you hear about like, and you have to do all this time, I have to position. So it might sound like a very high barrier or a very high like threshold of what's needed to do organizational learning, quote unquote. So I'm just grateful that you're talking about how it's really kind of about this commitment. It's really about putting things into practice. It's kind of finding what scale makes sense for whatever org is starting this work, right? What we're able to commit to in terms of times or resources. But I kind of just help that like it's as a scalable thing. It doesn't have to be a whole position. It doesn't have to be a whole like huge amount of budget for everybody, right? It could just be kind of that culture piece.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a big part of why it's worked here too is that we're prioritizing relationships, right? So we have values at CCEJ, right? Relationships, interdependence, curiosity. So I think those also help guide us in this work. I think about the fact that like relationships are what help us get through our work. And so ultimately, right, organizational learning is also about investment in those relationships, and investment in the people. I think about org learning too as not just about the PD or about the very formal things, but it's also about how are we just engaging and investing in the human beings, right, that contribute to this work.
Another question I had as we were thinking about, what maybe folks listening to this might be thinking about how do they bring organizational learning to their work, is maybe just you could talk a little bit about like just what are some barriers that you faced and you've had to overcome as you've been kind of building the road as you're walking it, right?
Yeah. I think the first thing that comes to mind is, just kind of defining org learning, right? I think that making the shift. So I was in another role previously, and so making the shift into this position, right, gave an opportunity to kind of define org learning. So I think that is possibly maybe the first barrier for folks, right, is to really kind of think about like, okay, what is the purpose of it for us as an organization, right? Why is it meaningful to us? I think that's important and might be part of what can help get folks to commit to this kind of work. I think too, the main things I've heard from our assessment, and this has been like every year that we've done it, is that like time and resources, right? Like there's very limited time. I know we're stretched a lot in the work that we're doing and that other folks are doing, and so creating time and space has been a barrier. And also, right, I think shifting the narrative of it being like an extra thing to it being part of the work has been an important piece of kind of challenging that barrier. Because I think sometimes when we think of learning, it's like, oh, it's this thing I do outside of my work, or it's this like nice to have, versus no, this is something that we want to do and we want to prioritize, because it allows us, right, to do our work better, right? So I think that's another barrier, is kind of like the mindset we have about what learning's purpose is, right?
That mindset shift is really important, right? Because I think especially in the nonprofit sector, but I think a lot of actually our school partners I think a lot of the folks we work with in different sectors struggle with this idea of like, we can take time away from the email, we can take time away from the reports or the training or whatever we're doing, and we can just read an article and really reflect on it, that we can kind of develop a skill set that maybe we're not so great in, that we can have a dialogue with like a colleague and talk about some of those things that we're maybe unsure about. So I just really appreciate that kind of mindset shift. A lot of our listeners are doing equity and justice work in different fields and different communities. And so I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little bit about specifically for those organizations, especially in the times that we're living in, right? Where, even just holding space is becoming an act of defiance against the systems. If you can maybe just talk about why organizational learning is actually really important to organizations doing that kind of work.
So if you've been in sessions with me, I share all the time, right, that the work that we do to learn and grow, especially within our organization right now, is it's an acknowledgement, right, of that the landscape of equity and justice is like constantly changing and shifting, and so we must evolve alongside it, right? So we can't just like sit happy, like, the articles I read like 10 years ago, right, are not going to help me today. And like you said, with everything going on right now, it is challenging us, inviting us, right, to continue learning and also unlearning. I think that is such a huge part of organizational learning in the context of equity and justice, is that it's not just about learning new things and learning things that will fill the gaps, but it's also how are we unlearning unhelpful patterns, right? How are we unlearning perhaps like conflict avoidance, or how are we unlearning things that don't allow us to root into relationships, right? And so I brought a quote that I hear often with Maya Angelou that says, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And so I think organizational learning allows us to step into that space of like acknowledging like, ooh, there are things that I still don't know that I need to grow in, that I need to understand, right, get perspective on. And when I get that new information or experience or skill, then I can improve the work that I'm doing, and also not just the work that I'm doing, but the way that I'm just being a human being in the world, right, and showing up for other people. And another thought too is around the willingness to change, to evolve. Like if I see you do that, if I see other folks do that, right, in my organization, then I'm going to be perhaps more willing to learn and grow, right? Like we're doing this work together, and I think that helps support us in inviting other people to do that, right? And so I also see it as like a ripple effect, right? Like if we're doing this work internally, right, that impacts other people, and and ultimately will hopefully build the army that I think we need to continue the equity and justice work and get to where we need to go to.
Hope folks are inspired to join the army of justice and anti-fascism, right, that we need in this moment. But I really appreciate you bringing in the Maya Angelou quote, right, that this really ultimately is about learning how we can be better and then doing better, right? The action piece. Well, thank you so much, Kathleah. I really appreciate you joining us today and just giving us such thoughtful insight into what organizational learning looks like, especially when we put it in action. Your work is helping shape not just the internal culture here at CCEJ, but really just how we show up in the world to create more just and equitable communities. So just thank you so much. I'll leave us all with that. Excited to continue the journey with you on organizational learning.
Yes, thank you.
If today's conversation sparked your interest, we invite you to learn more about CCEJ's training and facilitation services by visiting cacej.org/transformation. Whether you're looking to build stronger dialogue skills, deepen your team's understanding of equity, or navigate conflict in healthier ways, our team is here to support you. CCEJ's podcast is sponsored in part by LA vs. Hate, a coalition of partners led by the LA County Human Relations Commission, who are committed to preventing and ending hate in our communities. Once again, I'm Daniel Solis, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to hear more stories of thriving together.